What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of a Thinking Man's podcast. I'm your host. My name is Joseph PIRCHER. With me, as always, my good friend Tommy Stiles. And then today we are happy to present to you guys two of the best in the industry. We have IFBB pros, John Jewett and Chris Tuttle. Guys, what's going on? Thanks for taking the time.
Doing great, man. Doing great.
Yeah, appreciate having us on. The rare anomaly, right? The registered dietitian pros. I'm sure there's probably other ones by now. There's got to be, but we're going to say there's not, and it's just us. So happy to be here.
There's not many. There's not many.
No. That's for sure. Yeah, it's that's a unique thing that you guys both offer, and that was part of the thinking. Like Tommy and I wanted to have you guys on. You are like two of the most highly regarded names in the industry. And so, yeah, you guys are both registered dietitians, but today we wanted to talk training. So, Chris, off air, we talked and you brought up a great topic where, what you see in the gym is, I don't want to say mistakes, but it could just be a much better. So the general topic that I want to touch on is the most common mistakes or the biggest mistakes that we see in the gym, and then any solutions that we could provide to the audience. So, Chris, I'm just going to kick it over to you, and we'll go from there.
All right. So I'm so glad, John, you're here for this. It's like a fundamental thing that I keep having to repeat over and over, and then also send demo videos of myself demonstrating certain exercises and how to do them, is one, proper range of motion within a movement, specifically hack squat, leg press, squat. And then, of course, pressing movements and pull downs, right? You see people doing pull downs. They're excessively arching their back. They're allowing the upper arm to pass the midline of the body. They're extending their arm way up, extending their arm way down, getting momentum, swinging weight. And they're sitting there trying to improve their weaker body parts, and they're getting injured. They're getting tendinitis issues, and having to get people to pull back on weight, use more controlled technique, have the philosophy in their mind to say, I'm going to adjust tempo, weight, and rep range to get the most mind-muscle connection and highest rep qualities possible, is very difficult. I don't know why, because John is yourself. You're doing a lot of demo exercises of great technique, great form, putting through to people out there who follow you the correct way to execute certain movements. You see people like Nick Walker using controlled motions. There's more people using more controlled movements and better movement patterns overall than back in the 90s, right? But yet I still see amateurs swinging weight, moving stuff around, complaining of knee pain. And then you look at their ankle mobility, it's complete trash. And then the less range of motion they use, the more decreased movement in the joint they get. And then it creates this. And then they position their feet wider to get better leverage points, not maximizing tension in the muscle. And then it's a disaster. And then trying to get them to go back with a full range of motion. Now, that's one. And the other aspect of that is full range of motion the most important thing, not the most important thing, a very important factor to create muscle hypertrophy. Personally, since I've been training now because of boxing, I try to use full range of motion possible, so I can have full movement in my joint from an athletic standpoint. But I noticed that I hurt less. I'm actually taking more shape than I have before, even as a bigger bodybuilder. I've had better mind-muscle connection. I have less aches and pains, less issues with my tendons. So that being said, John?
Yeah, I think just starting on the range of motion aspect, and with the current environment around social media, and I feel like everyone is hungry to do things in a more, like, if you want to say evidence-based way, but just a more way. It doesn't have to necessarily be off science, but yeah, I just see much more people putting out information that aligns with research, but also just more of a kind of like the podcast, a thinking man's podcast, right? So, with that being said, like, we have to say, like, what are these main drivers of hypertrophy? Like, what really causes it? It's mechanical tension at the fiber level. I think that when that first kind of came about in the research world, everyone's like, yeah, just lift heavy weights. And the thing is, like, holding a heavy weight and making yourself very advantageous to move it like a power lifter doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more tension on the muscle. You could just move in a way to make it easier to lift that weight, even though the external load's heavy. So I think when they start talking like that, and others are putting out information around, hey, like if you're getting stronger, you should be getting bigger. That's always not the case either, because you can move in a way to lift more load. So circling this back, like tension on the muscle, when you move into longer muscle lengths, the muscle has a greater ability to produce force. In other words, expose itself to tension. And to get a little bit sciencey, there's a review paper, systematic review, all the studies kind of combined into range of motion versus partial range of motion. This was by like Brad Schoenfeld. It only narrowed it down to 6 studies. So there's actually not a lot of studies just looking comparatively at range of motion. All the lower bodies showed that longer muscle lengths, so when muscles stretch, like in the bottom of a squat, hack squat, leg press, had better hypertrophy than the short partial range of motion. Now, the upper body training, there was only 2 studies in that paper, and one was a tricep pushdown, like constant tension, and actually had better hypertrophy. The bicep curl at long muscle lengths did better than the short range of motion, so a little bit mixed on the upper body. But another cool paper after that review paper came out with looking at the leg extension, and it looked at this thing like partials out of the bottom versus partials out of the top versus people doing the full range of motion on the leg extensions. And it actually showed a different growth in different parts of the thigh. So people that were cutting out the very top of the movement, they actually still had good like proximal and distal muscle growth. It showed better overall hypertrophy just training out of the bottom, which kind of aligns with the rest of the research. Like you were training like even out of the bottom off that stretch, like that's probably the most hypertrophic area to train in. But also cutting out part of the range, you might miss out on getting the full development of the muscle. So all that being said, most of the literature points around like, hey, take the movements through the full range of motion. However, we see bodybuilders anecdotally that like you've seen like old Jay Cutler videos. He's just like pushing the dumbbells out of the bottom and kind of cutting off the top where it doesn't have a lot of that tension. Joints start getting stacked. So that might be okay with certain lifts, but at least if you want to go off like some of the studies we have, which isn't a lot, most of the time it points through and training around the full range. Do you find problems, Chris, with when you have instances where guys do train full stretch but aren't locking out? Do you come across guys that are like maybe taking it too far that way?
I generally see the opposite, right?
Opposite, yeah. Cutting it short at the top.
Cutting it short where they can leverage the most weight possible.
Yeah.
And then, and I try to explain to them sometimes like, oh, my shoulders bother me. I'm like, listen, man, like if you are training in a limited range of motion where the muscle's not being challenged in the lengthened position, you're starting to exacerbate this forward shoulderness, right? You're going to start to get, in my opinion, or develop more joint dysfunction. And then when you compensate and you reach fatigue, because everybody compensates when they reach failure, everybody does. Yeah. Whether to some degree we can see it or feel it, but some people, they start compensating, then you result in injury because you're lifting weight you ultimately can't handle. I've had numerous clients this year, like I got them to reduce their weight by like 30% and use full range of motion. And they're like, dude, my joints feel great, but my chest is growing. It feels wonderful. Now I got better flexibility in my shoulder. Luckily I don't have, people doing just the first 4 or 5 inches because most people are not that strong in that particular range of motion. It's one thing you said that stuck out to me, John, was when you challenge a muscle in most lengthened positions, like it's obviously more difficult to extend your arm straight and do a bicep curl than it is to do this, right?
Yeah.
So you're challenging at a greater degree. And of course, those fibers now are all stretched out to the end where they're not very strong, where they're going to be more adaptation. And too many people keep having this mindset. I need to do more frequency. I need to do more volume. I need to do more weight. But the option is never, maybe I need to look at how I'm doing these movements and how I can make them better. Because it's always, maybe I should add a chest day. Maybe I'm going to do an extra working set. I'm going to do an extra back off set, an extra intensifier. I'm going to do cluster sets. I'm going to do all this stuff. but nobody says, Chris, how can I make the movement I'm doing better? And that is why it scratches my head, and why that never crosses anybody's mind, because I see Jay Cutler using 150s, 160s, 170s. I got dudes at my gym doing that who are like a quarter the size. It's like, does it ever scratch somebody's head being like, I'm trying to get bigger, I'm using all this gear, it's not working, but that dude's got 80 pounds on me. Oh, it must be better gear. Or the training, the deficit is really more the training, and it's not the diet and the gear.
Chris, you talked about this like a transition. Did you train during your career? Did you not train with full ranges, or did you kind of disregard the full range of motion style?
Dude, I'm old. I'm 40. So I've done everything wrong at one point or another. But typically, which is really funny in my own self and anecdotal studies, for legs, I always had big quads as an amateur. I always did super full range of motion for legs, right? My chest, I didn't, and my chest sucked, right? And my back didn't. My chest didn't start to get better until, ready for this, John? Until I injured my pec. And then I had to be like, how do I make this lighter weight that I can handle without my pec hurting harder? So I had to learn how to regain way more mind muscle connection. How do I make this 80-pound dumbbell feel like that 130? And then my chest started to grow. But that's ultimately what it led to. I mean, the knowledge I know now obviously keeps progressing of what I see my clients and even myself. I'm on TRT now, and I train 3 days a week, and I train full range of motion, and my body's like bouncing back faster. And I actually, in some degree, in some poses, like it looks better than it was when I was 265 pounds, you know?
A similar background there. Like I came from powerlifting, right? So you had to squat like to parallel or slightly below. However, bench pressing, I had like this huge arch, and I try to really limit the range. I thought like, man, I'm going to have this huge chest, but I didn't. Like my chest has always been this weak point. Big triceps because I would press with tris. So, the range of motion, getting into that, like it definitely makes a big difference. Part of the issue too was also training like that for so long. I think it kind of limited my ability to have full range, and came into like a lot of injuries trying to get into that range. Because once you have a load in your hands, like it'll take you there, but you might not have the ability to go into that range just yet. So training full range motion, I think that's a great tool to be able to gain access and mobility, and strengthen those end ranges to protect yourself from injury. But also, like, I find a lot of guys that we end up just having like poor access to these ranges. Like, you're talking about getting into like doing a pull down correctly or overhead press, right? Most guys can't do an overhead press. They don't have that external rotation in the arm to even get in the position, but they then do it and force it in. And then they're like, hey, my rotator cuff's really getting beat up. It's like, yes, we want to use like the range of motion, but an exercise that fits your ability to do it. So I usually try to get guys like, hey, let's look at how you move just with body weight before you even put a load in your hands, and let's fit the machine to you, not the opposite, right? So I see a lot of guys like forcing themselves into the quote unquote optimal machine, but it's not optimal because it doesn't really fit their mechanics best. So that's where you're talking about, Chris, of like trying to get the most out of your volume before you just keep doing more. Like that's like picking exercises that fit within your capacity to move. You talked about drugs, and people will love a drug analogy. It's if you're growing off 200 milligrams of testosterone, well, you're like, hey, well, I'll just use more to grow more. It's like, well, what if your testosterone's not dosed accurately? You had some guy making it in some bathtub and it's really only 50 milligrams of testosterone. Why don't you just make that better quality before doing more, right? It's like same thing of your sets. Make your sets really, really high quality before you just add in more shitty sets. Then I think that even the reduction in total volume in that sense will keep you from beating yourself up more. Because yes, like lifting heavy loads will beat you up, but also a ton of volume can also beat you up too, especially when it's shitty quality.
One thing that I've fallen into, I've been a victim of this to my own self, is, and I see this as well with people, they get a type of injury or say they lack ankle mobility and they're like, oh, my knees hurt. So they start pushing their feet out on the platform of the leg press, on the hack squat to work with the range of motion they have. And then they keep going heavier, right? And then their knees still start to hurt. And they're like, oh man, this really hurts. So I'm going to use reverse band now. I'll add a reverse band to the top and then still keep doing it. And you end up having a problem, which you don't fix. And then you end up working around that problem in the wrong way that ends up exacerbating that issue. Because now you're never challenging the ankle mobility. Now it's just going to get worse. And now your knees are still getting that shearing force with heavy loads, and you keep manipulating movements to make it easier instead of looking at the root problem. I mean, I've done that myself to my shoulders before with chest, where you have a chest exercise that bothers you. You're like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead of ever addressing the problem. And then all of a sudden, 3 months down the road, now 4 variations of chest press bother me and I can't do. And now it's turned into, I can't do shoulder press. Then it hurts me when I do extended lat pull down. When instead of just addressing the problem, working around, people would say to me all the time, I'm sure you guys hear this all the time. Oh, I can't squat or I can't deadlift anymore. Oh, but why? My back hurts. Why does your back hurt? Well, I don't know. I can do hack squat, I can do leg press now, but I can't do squat. And they're like, oh, do you do core exercises? Oh, like crunches? No, like they're not, they have the worst core stability and the core strength possible. I'm like, do you understand that if you have good hip mobility and you have good core strength, you're going to be able to do a lot of these more movements more efficiently? Not to mention your stomach's not going to be super distended on the hack squat and they're going down on the leg press. You're going to have better core control. Your physique's going to be better. That's like a other thing that I see people do is they start avoiding exercises. And the more advanced a bodybuilder becomes with experience time, it seems like the less movements they're able to do, which that shouldn't be the case.
I've noticed the core control is that's a huge one with bracing into your core on all movements. That's a huge one I'm correcting with a lot of my clients in videos, is just having an idea of what your core is doing throughout the movement, especially on the hack squat. If you notice that your lower back is pulling away from the pad as you go down into the negative, that means you have no core activation and your whole body is systemically failing. And that's why the lower back pumps kick in on the hack squat. I used to do it. And then it took me learning how to control my core, which happens both with practicing bracing, and I had to get rid of the belt. I think you probably learned how to wear a belt properly, John, as a power lifter, but like I never learned how to wear one. I just put it on as tight as it would go and made it like a corset. So I never really actually understood what the purpose of the belt was. And then some power lifters at a gym in Detroit showed me one day. And then I realized I had this really weak core, but I've always had visible abs. So I never really thought I had a bad core. But once I ditched the belt, I started learning how to keep my mind contracted with my core, or connected with my core. And then I'm able to use planks and side planks as a way to train the core. I think that's the biggest one I see, is just complete disregard for the core at all in any of the movement patterns, whether it's pressing, pulling, or legs.
Because then it creates mass compensation. Yeah. And then ultimately sometimes just takes you out of what you're trying to target.
Right.
It seems like, I know with a lot of like hypertrophy training, a lot of times we're talking about moving to very braced movements. Like everyone goes to hack squats or a machine press, and eventually they're all externally braced, which can be fine. It's actually great for hypertrophy because you just kind of want tension in the muscle that you're working, right? However, I eventually got to movements where everything was so braced that eventually you run into the part of the road where stuff starts breaking anyway. Like just like you're saying, Chris, like, I was back squatting, kind of have a problem, go to a hack squat, it's more brace and stabilized. Like I can keep going, but that root issue's never addressed. And eventually, like even on a very brace movement, you start having issues. So like reworking that and keeping in some movements that challenge your ability to internally stabilize go a long way to transfer to all your other movements. Like for me, like shoulder health was like keeping in like a dumbbell press, like it challenges like shoulder stability and strength. I'm not huge on getting people doing like balance movements. Like I know that if you go to like PT, they'll have you like, hey, stand on this one leg and try to push this kettlebell with like one finger and you're like, wow, this is really hard. It's like, that's like a balance challenge. Like for what we're doing, like we need strength in the joint. And so that's going to come from challenging that aspect. So getting back to where you're having to do like a single leg pattern or like a dumbbell press, like something that's going to challenge it, or just like with the core, people hate on like bent over barbell rows, but for me, that was another way to practice like hinging and like bracing my core and rowing. And it was carrying over to my other movements as well. So there's what's the best way to train the core? Like, yeah, some of the ones, absolutely. You mentioned Tommy too, but just doing the lift that you need, that's required to brace the core in. Like I'm sure some big power lifter like that squats 1,000, like his core's probably really fucking strong. And I don't know how he's probably training, like he's probably not doing body weight crunches to train that strength, right? So something about getting into a pattern that just requires that strength and stability will train that. So I think getting away from it in bodybuilding, it can lead to problems down the road.
As a general recommendation, do you guys have an outline of what someone should at minimum be doing for ab training? Because I see so many people that just do none, that do zero.
Yeah, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, with all this stuff, it's, start needs analysis. Like, where is this person coming from and what are the issues presenting? And a lot of the movements might need to be regressed or progressed. So have someone that is not able to back squat because something's happening, like, hey, I want them to be training. So we might move to a hack squat, but then work on that issue that's cropped up. Maybe it's with the ankles or something, right? But then as far as like the core training goes, with bodybuilding in mind, because I still like think, well, except for Chris, like he always has big ass abs, but you just like training any other muscle group, it needs to be taken through the full range of motion and be able to load. So I'll usually have like either doing like a weighted crunch off like a glute ham raise, or like a decline reverse crunch off of like a decline bench, or just doing like rope crunches, something loaded for like at least hypertrophy aspect. I won't do a lot of loaded like plank work, just for like the obliques. I do like just doing rotations, not really loaded, but just moving through a rotation, practicing those more for like posing work. Then the last one that I think has good benefit is on that same glute ham raise, doing a crunch off them. When you come all the way back and extend, like for one, you really eccentrically load a lot in the lengthen phase for an ab, which is hard to do. Usually it gets really hard when you're crunching. Just have them hold that lengthened out and focus on keeping like a flat stomach, pelvis in line with the sternum. And that will really challenge like their TVA and having to brace. And if you put someone in that position, usually you start seeing like their whole body quivering. It's like, yeah, your TVA is like super weak. That's like just a good rough outline of what I typically do. So have like 2 crunch movements, one moves sternum to pelvis, one moves pelvis to sternum, something rotational wise just for like function of posing, then some type of like plank work. That's kind of the outline that I go with.
For me, most of the time, nobody's working core or doing abs at all.
Yeah.
So I will do something very simple, very quick, because people don't like we're training abs. They hate it. So sometimes I look at their overall plan, what they're going to do realistically. So McGill curl ups, they call them silly. I think they work great. McGill curl up, side planks, dead bugs, the push up plank, when you're pushing your stratus anterior, pushing your shoulders all the way out, and then exhaling, blowing in and holding for a plank. Those are variations of core exercises I do. I usually have them pick 2 of those, any 2 of their favorites they like to do, and do them in the start of the workout. So like, I'm like, dude, if you could do at the end of the workout, you're probably not going to do them. Not to mention you go in, you're probably not going to do your 10 minutes of cardio. You just want to get into training, but do the core movements first. You'll get warm. Your core will be warmed up, less likely to injure your back. And then you get going. And then as far as a hypertrophy standpoint, John, I usually tell them rope crunches, and sometimes even medicine ball Russian twists for a rotational movement. But like, I'm so into that powerlifting mindset of like challenging your core in the static position, right? So like your medicine ball Russian twist, or you just carefully bring the ball and place it down, bring the ball, but everything's completely straight. instead of having them do actual rotational movements. But that's really it. I just tell them to hit it really hard, do it consecutively. You can superset them or giant set them in a row, and get it done. And of course, nothing better than strengthening your core than actually engaging your core when you do the movements, right? It's like if you can do 350-pound front squat with perfect technique and no belt, you have a pretty decent score. You know?
Yeah. You leave it no choice. It better be damn good if you're in a front
or
squat.
you're just gonna fold, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I find that a big issue. And then I find ankle mobility a humongous issue with most people. Actually, I would say 98% of people who tell me they can't squat have poor ankle mobility and poor core strength. And that's usually why. And they're using too heavy weight because, not to be rude, but guys, you're not that strong. And most bodybuilders aren't as strong as they think they are. And that's the root problem. I had a conversation with a client today about that. I'm like, he's like, dude, you got to do full range of motion leg press. None of this, I know, Ronnie Coleman's the best, but these Ronnie Coleman reps, he's like, these quarter reps, like that's not going to cut it. And I'm like, bro, bring it all the way down, position your feet like this, adjust the back pad slightly back, and go slow, controlled, and then squeeze out. And he goes, oh, I don't have mobility to do that. I'm like, take the 15 plates off each side, start with like 5 plates, and then try it. That's the hardest part. Get people to do that.
Yeah, it's like, why do people have like no adductors? Like most of them don't. It's like you're not able to go like deep squat, deep leg press. Like that will give you big ass adductors and fill in the gaps of like all having the lower body shots you want. Like go deep, but most guys just aren't, or they like don't have the access just yet. You did bring up a point too about getting in the movements, right, Chris? And I think we just like probably got poor cueing like earlier on, like when I was in high school and football and stuff. It was just like same thing. Tell me like you cinch your belt like as tight as you can. Coach is like chest up, and you like chest is cued up, which arches the lower back really hard. And what happens to the stomach? It like rounds over, right? So now like everything's stabilized by just spine, vertebrae on vertebrae, and not actual core muscle engagement. So just giving the right cues to clients when they are getting into those patterns of like, hey, if you're about to get like punched in the stomach, like what would you do? It's like, oh, you like kind of cinch down your abs, like pelvis over sternum, abs go flat. Like that's your squat brace that you want, with a little bit of push out if you're starting to use a belt. But I usually don't use a belt until maybe like getting up to like top sets, because for bodybuilding, I almost don't think you need it if you're truly using like full range and trying to almost use the lightest weight and make it as hard as possible. I don't think we necessarily need belts. But if you're using that core engagement, man, that'll really train your ability to brace in the squat. And also when people like have that cue of like kicking the chest up and arching the back, like the hips anteriorly tilt and you lose hip range of motion. So as they go down, then what happens? They max out their hip and they butt wink hard. A little bit's okay, but either that might be the end of their squat or their hips just really round over. And part of that might be because their ankles really suck in mobility, but also it could start from the top of the squat when you're cueing that really hard chest up, and starting out that way. So just setting someone up properly, give them those cues, will train the core, but also give them the ability to probably get more range out of their squat pattern.
I wish everybody could hear that on repeat every day, all day, because that was like perfectly said. And John, I have a question for you in a minute. But I haven't used a belt in years. There's no point for me, right? And I've been squatting again, and my legs are stronger now than I was when I was all juiced up at 265. And I put on a belt the other day, and I couldn't even do the movement. It felt so foreign to me because I've been so reliant on my own core strength with the weights I'm using, But as far as adductor development, and 100%, right? People aren't using full range of motion, not getting the deep squat. They're using the leverage points to maximize the weight loaded, not positioning themselves to maximize the tension on the quads. Now we have leg adduction, right? I see people who have poor adductor development doing leg adduction constantly, but yet there's no growth. I see people who do crazy full range of motion who don't do adduction machine. They have huge adductors. So I'm saying to myself, I'm like, lately could be wrong, John, you correct me if I am. I just don't see the application of putting in leg adduction to somebody who has weak adductors. Instead, rather focus on getting fuller range of motion and all the movements they are doing and they should be doing correctly. Because they're like, dude, my adductors suck. I've been doing this twice a week. And I'm looking at their lunge, I'm looking at their squat, their hack squat, their leg press, and they're all shallow reps. And I'm like, well, why don't we just get rid of this waste of time? And let's focus more on getting that, because I've never done that my entire life. And my legs touched each other almost halfway down my thigh, and I do, obviously it's a genetic component, but I've always done super full range of motion.
Yeah. I think there's a few things around that. So I agree. For one, in full range of motion, like it's like comparing like what's the better quad movement, right? Like a squat where you're going to load that big lengthen range, or a leg extension. Should you this is like the squat's like the compound movement for the adductor, loading it lengthened, while we have like this isolation movement for just the adductors. I think if you're already started using full range and you might have the genetic propensity, that volume is adequate, right, to drive plenty of growth. Now, I have some people that still train like that, but man, that's just like their genetic weak point. And we don't have the ability to add in more squat or leg press volume. And they might be the person that needs a little bit isolation in place. I could see that for that person. But if you have the case, right, that someone's just not getting down to depth and not getting to that point where you might have the best adductor stimulus, that would be the first thing. Also, I see a lot of guys that put it in the beginning of training, and a great way to get access to range of motion and increase, actually, if you're trying to increase a muscle length, is go through a loaded eccentric. So some people put adductors in first before they go squat to load the eccentric phase to open up the hips more to be able to get into that range. Now, I would see that more as like a training for function, not necessarily like trying to pre-fatigue the adductors and train on failure before you go squat. I think that's a bad idea. But I could see it as like trying to gain some access and extra mobility for those people that maybe they've been short in the range of motion for a long time and need to try to open up the hips more. So I think it's kind of like one of those, it depends things. Like if you're using full range of motion and doing those, checking those boxes, and your adductors still just really suck, probably worth adding in a little bit of isolation. But it's for those guys that are already doing full range and have great adductors. Yeah, you probably never need it. Like for me, like I've always squatted like that, and I've always had huge adductors. So like I never really needed to do direct work. Same in that boat.
It's not very fun because your legs rub together all the time and you burn holes through your jeans, burn holes through your pants.
Yeah, you gotta change. You gotta change the style of boxers that you wear. It changed my whole life. Having pretty big legs, pretty adductors. You need to start wearing compression shorts everywhere you go. So you gotta have baby powder on you everywhere you go.
There's a kind of a reoccurring thing you brought up, Chris, is like and I suffer for this one, like coming from powerlifting, because training when I started training, it was definitely very emotionally driven. I put a lot of like anger, aggression into my training, and training's almost always been like this kind of therapy session, and that can be a little overwhelming at times, to where I'm still training in a way that I want to train and not how I need to train. And so putting that into my movement patterns to where I am just probably going to excessive points where that are not productive form wise, that are not productive, like going past failure points. That's limiting my overall training session because I'm so fatigued from just harnessing, like, summoning everything I can, slaughtering the goat before you do your set. Then that also leads into the rest of the week being impacted from like that really hard leg session, to where my total volume is now impacted for just good productive growth. So I think I get a lot of guys still that, and I see a lot of it too, that are very emotionally charged with training, and there's a time for it, but there's a balance to it as well. I see the opposite too, where some guys just need to push it and they need to get a little bit aggressive in the gym too. And they're way too concerned with over analyzing, very, very strict form. I think it depends where your niche kind of is. Like, I think if you're like really in the science-based kind of community, more natural community, you kind of get some of that. If you're real like in the bro world, like you kind of get some of the, let me just throw some weight around, train to failure all the time. So there's a middle ground to strike and trying to analyze like, hey, what do you really need to do in the gym today to be productive versus emotionally what you want to do? And I think that's the athlete development process to try to take someone through to reach that psychological point where they can make those decisions and not let training be as emotional, but still enjoyable, right?
That's the hard part, right? When you get somebody like that. I have one guy that likes to train just balls out. And like, I'm like, dude, you're having to deload like every like second week. Like you're crashing your CNS, like you're crashing your CNS constantly. And like we figured out played all these variables. We finally figured out. I'm like,
that guy needs a therapist, man. He is going through some shit.
Animal. Like you can't have volume like 20 working sets and train like Dorian. It doesn't work. Ooh, so we finally compromised. He trains 4 days a week. That's it. And then these are his sets, but now it's good. But some people are like, not many people are like that, you know, like where he just says, dude, if I had, like you said, John, you have to enjoy your training. He's like, if I have to train this volume stuff and I can't train that intensity, then I don't want to do it. I feel like I'm wasting my time. And I'm like, dude, let's find a balance there. But like you said, John, a balance with recommendations. If I say to somebody, hey man, you got to slow the weight down, feel it more. And then all of a sudden the next day they're like, oh, I was doing 10-second eccentrics. No. That's not what I mean. My mean is like, you're sitting there exploding the weight. There's a big difference between this and you're doing this. Now the ability to load the muscle, the weight has to be so much lighter now. If you're going to do 10 reps of 10-second eccentrics, right? It's like they hear it and they go to the effects are extreme, but they don't understand that philosophy. I've been explaining to people lately is in like your primary goal is to make sure your rep quality and your execution is great, meaning the weight whatever movement you're using and the muscle you're targeting, you're feeling it right there. Okay, if you have that or you don't have that, you adjust tempo, your rep range, or your weight to feel that. Obviously, a lateral raise at 8 reps might not be the best move, right? A little high reps might be better. But 15 reps on a bench press or a chest press might not feel the best. Maybe 8 reps is better. That's me by adjusting rep range and weight. And then sometimes you might need to move slower with certain movements to feel it where you need to based on how your body's built. And sometimes you're able to move a little bit faster and still able to keep that connection. And then from there, try to get more reps before trying to get heavier. And then once you're able to progress a little more reps, then start trying to increase a little bit more weight. Because people always like that objective measurement of progress. If I'm moving more weight, I must be making progress. As we all know in this game, that's not always true because let's be honest, from the first time we did a bicep curl, in our mind, in the newbie gains, we're like, in 10 years, I'll be curling 110-pound dumbbells. But it's going to come to the point, obviously, you're going to max out your body's ability to move weight in that movement. That's a difficult thing. One thing I want to also say, I was on a podcast with Milos and James, and everybody knows Hollingshead is strong as fuck, right?
Yeah.
And Milos starts coming at James, being like, you gotta change your training. You're not training right. You gotta do this, you gotta do that. And James is like, Milos, I don't train like that. That's just for Instagram. Like, I'm not doing that all the time. And if you really see the sets that I do, I'm actually moving very slow. I trained with him for 3 days when he came and visited me, and he trains exactly how he said he trained the podcast. And then sometimes he goes heavy because he likes to go heavy. He knows it's not necessary to squat 8 plates on each side for a set of 10, you know, but like he can. But like, dude, we were doing legs, and I know he was taking it easy because it wasn't his true leg day, but his knee flexion, his ankle mobility was just ridiculous. And come down slow, push with the quads, come down slow, push with the quads, instead of like just hinging at the knee and loading all that weight on the hip. You know what I'm saying? But it's funny that projection of Instagram where people see how certain people train, they're like, that's how you're supposed to train. But they don't understand is if James puts his set he did of the squat machine we did on, you know, very slow, very careful with moderate weight, that's not exciting to a viewer. It's exciting to a viewer to see 8 plates squat on each side. And then all of a sudden the viewer goes, that's how you train. No, you don't. Nobody's doing that all the time, you know, and that's, I think that's a hard thing to break, because what is glamorous and gets views is not how the vast majority of people like John has gotten to where he is.
Yeah, it's easy with Instagram. Just it's a highlight reel, right? Of like you're gonna put your like best top sets on there when you're looking your strongest, and that just gives a improper perception of how someone really does execute. So I think social media has kind of been an influencer around that, right? But I, with those the failure aspect guy, like the really guy that is super aggressive with training, I try to compromise within those situations. Like, hey, isolation movements, like I want you to like take those where you want them to. Sometimes I think reversing it for these guys, like because if you start with your squat, like that's gonna be your strongest movement, and that's when it can really probably generate a lot of fatigue too. So like reversing it for this guy, right? Like leg extension, like to leg press, like then to squat, like even if he's training that hard, like it's still going to be really hard muscular wise to like squat the same load after doing those things. So, and then trying to compromise on this cueing point to eventually get him to back down. But I mean, you're right, Chris. I mean, there's the middle ground in all of this, and yes, you should be moving more load over time, but that's not the main goal, because then you're a powerlifter, right?
John, what about minimizing in a situation like Nate? What about minimizing movements that are so spinal loading? Would you ever sit that? And this is what I do. I'll be like, oh, you're doing barbell row, you're doing deadlift, you're doing dumbbell row in the same workout. Like, let's maybe do a chest supported row. Let's maybe do a machine row, or which exercise do you love? I love deadlifts. Okay, then maybe we should keep deadlifts and then take some of the other movements out, or replace maybe the squat every other week with a hack squat. Do you ever do that, anything like that, to kind of minimize that CNS load?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the recovery capacity of the person, and what I find, and there's some different like dogmatic camps that put out information that kind of guides a lot of what I see, right? There's some that have a list of like 10 exercises and maybe only 1 or 2 sets, right? Those are the like guys that are going really, really hard on those sets. But then you look through that exercise list, it gets kind of repetitive. Like you're going to do the barbell row, then like the single arm dumbbell row. Then it's like, if the elbow is finishing in the same point, we're relatively training the same muscle group. Rather than doing 1-2 sets on these 2 different exercises, why don't we just do 3 or 4 extra sets of one of those exercises, right? Like, I think it's a time efficiency component that with training, because see guys that we're just getting stuck in a pattern of like, hey, you have to do 2 sets. Why not do 3 or 4 and make your exercise list a lot smaller? And then rather than using up all your exercise variety, right? Like you have your gym equipment, like these are my best pieces of equipment, and you're using them your entire program. It's like, why don't we just put some of those on the shelf? So when that one gets stagnant, you have some great option to go to. So I think there's that component, right? You're the group that has way too many exercises. And usually I see like those are the groups that are doing really few sets. I think the other one is just doing excessive volume, just like to the point where it's like short rest periods. And I don't want to say it's like the kind of the Milo style. I think he gets kind of put in that bucket, right, of doing circuits. But the same thing happens of like doing those repetitive patterns where, hey, this volume just kind of, it's not really that productive anymore. So but to your point, depends on the strength level too of the individual and how new they are. Like someone's just starting out, like the amount of load they're going to lift is probably systemically not too taxing, but definitely as you get more advanced, like to have like a heavy axial loading pattern in one session, that kind of might be it. And usually that's how I structure things too. Like I might have a squat on a leg day, but that's really going to be it. Like there's not going to be a stiff leg deadlift or something. Or if we're doing a bent over row, like that's going to be the only pattern for that day. And also keeping in mind what you have to do the next day, right? So if you're doing all your like bent over row work, then you have to go like squat the next day. Like that's probably going to limit your movement. So you need to kind of consider that in your programming. You brought up something earlier, Chris, about like training abs. I think that's what, depending on how you're training them, I know you're doing more like, hey, activating for bracing, but if you are going to train first, like maybe considering like, are you going to have a movement that's going to require a high amount of bracing for that day, just so you're not like pre-fatiguing the core, right? I know that's not what you meant. So like if you did that maybe on a push day, well, you're not going to have like all the axial loading like you would on a leg day, or maybe a back day if someone's doing RDLs or something on that day. But no, I agree. I think look out for having like repetitive patterns that just train the muscle the same way. Be okay just doing more sets of the same exercise if you need that much volume, and that will just save you time, be efficient, and not use up your exercise variety too quickly.
You guys want something? I got something to add in a minute, but you got anything to say, Joe?
I was gonna, if we were done with that, I was gonna transition to something else. But if you have another point, go
I'll
ahead.
do one quick point. You know, there's a philosophy or strategy of doing like all out sets of like one or two or even one, where there's less volume but higher intensity in that particular exercise. And I mean, personally, I have trained like that way, and I didn't feel the most benefit, because it always feels like, for me, kind of like, say if you're a pitcher, right? And it's like, okay, you have 2 pitches before you can throw your fastest pitch of the day. I'm like, I'm not gonna feel very confident about that, right? I like to kind of work my shoulder into that motion, a couple extra sets, but not to the point of fatigue before I can really rip that ball. And I feel like a lot of clients, especially of my caliber that I work with, need almost a few extra sets of that repetition movement for practice, right? To get that execution in their mind correctly, versus spending such a little time and such high intensity, because then obviously if the execution is not there, they're training with that high intensity, they're going to compensate, train their body to train that faulty movement pattern. You know, I know Dorian Yates's method was so popular with so many people. John, and we can finish off this topic with that. Do you feel that most people at an amateur level aren't ready for that type of training because of the execution really hasn't been fully developed yet, right? Like you and I might be able to do that, but I feel like most people who are trying to maximize their movement patterns and gain more rep quality, like, are they going to get the most out of their training by doing that one all-out set and keeping the volume very low, the intensity high?
Yeah, I think a lot of these guys might be also kind of misreading. Like if you actually look through like Dorian's log, have you ever seen his training logs? Like,
Yeah,
he did quite a few like build up sets to that. And I think like once you do get to that advanced level, you are able to generate so much stimulus out of one set, and you probably doing an extra set is probably the point where you like couldn't even recover from. I think that's when someone maybe gets to that point, but most of us aren't there. And like how I would instruct like even beginners is that, get the most from the least. Like a beginner doesn't have to train even close to failure at all. Like
Right.
it should be about them getting proper exercise execution down, and like you said, practice. Like they just need practice doing the movement. So to take a beginner and say, hey, you're going to do one set to failure, like it makes illogical sense. Like you need to train this person how to do the movement. They're going to get the most from the least of staying away from failure, and then they can have more practice doing more sets. That should just scale up as you get more advanced, and then those sets will get more stimulating, because that person should probably start training closer to failure. At some point, that person's going to get so strong that total sets, you might actually have to be doing a little less volume. And I think that's how that spectrum might go. But so I think for the majority of people, also consider that these things are tools, like training to failure or training farther away from failure. It's not one or the other. It's just one variable. And there should be times where, hey, you should be pushing someone to that point so they know where it is, but also it's exercises that are just inappropriate to do it on. So we can't get dogmatic around you should train a failure, you shouldn't. Like that's not the conversation we should even be having. It's how should you be programming each one into the program and when. So I think I agree. Most people shouldn't be starting with like a low volume program. It should probably be a little higher in volume, a little farther away from failure. And then once they have that perfectly down, then that effort levels increased up over time, and volume would just fall within what they're able to recover from. And that's in general how I would kind of program it. I've definitely started in the camp. Don't get me wrong. I started in the camp with like DC training, and you just do hard sets to failure. And that's another story. Like I was just not understanding fully like the concept of what that was trying to come across, like keeping good form and all that too. So, yeah.
If I could, that I want to add to that, because that is such a good point. And I was in that kind of early camp too, where I was a big Dorian Yates fan, and I love the blood and guts videos. I love the idea of like just get in there and just smash these couple sets that you're going to do and then move on. And for me, at least, like especially like the early to middle part of my journey, it just wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough stimulus. I wasn't good enough at training. I didn't have the skill of training down to where those few sets were stimulative enough. Like you said, John, like that worked for Dorian because he was a fucking expert. He was a expert craftsman at what he was doing. Like it took him an entire career to get to that point to where those few sets were stimulative enough for him to grow. And even so, when you look at the actual log, like you said, he's doing somewhere between like 10 and 16 working sets a week per body part, depending on what it was.
Yeah, I think it fits within like the volume recommendations of what we normally see. So
yeah. So
I think for yourself too, right, Joseph? You were like you could do a hard set, and mechanically maybe it wasn't the most stimulating for the muscle. Also, be very fatigue wise. Right, to where like the rest of your session would be like you're in a brain fog and just trying to get by, and then even the day after leg day is just like you're like dead, right, fatigued.
Yeah, but it's just to that point though. It's just a good point that I didn't. It took me quite a while to understand in my own journey that, like you said, the idea of practice and just improving the quality of the reps so that you can eventually need less at the end of it. But we only have a little bit, but one thing, and maybe this isn't even the best topic to try to fit in at 10 minutes out, but one thing I would like to hear your guys' opinions on, because we've touched on a couple of the different aspects of training. And Chris, you mentioned it earlier. I'd like to hear what your guys' perspective is somewhat briefly on like manipulating strength curves. Because you had mentioned earlier, like the idea of reverse banding that hack squat. And it's like, most of the people that I see, if we're talking about the big theme of the episode being like mistakes that we see in the gym, that reverse band hack squat is probably the most bastardized thing that I've seen. And it's because, like you said, Chris, the idea of it is to kind of match the strength curve, where it's like it kind of slightly deloads you at the bottom and then gains tension as you get stronger through the top, which makes sense. If it's applied correctly, the reasoning behind it does make sense. And you could see why there would be scenarios where it makes sense. What I see 99% of the time is someone loading the heaviest band that they can, sometimes multiple heavy ass bands around it. That way, the guy that's 180 pounds and still doesn't really look like he works out yet can put 8 plates aside on the hack squat and do it. So knowing that that's not what we're doing it for, or why we want to do it. I just want to hear your guys' take on the idea of like manipulating these strength curves like that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll jump in
John,
first thing. Yeah. I think with any of these things, they're tools to be used. And like you go back to the early on the podcast, like we just talked about loading in the stretch position, and what the research shows is that, and anecdotally, that's what we see too, is like that's where you get the best growth.
Yep.
So if you're creating exercises that deload the most hypertrophic range of the motion, potentially you can make it a less beneficial movement pattern. Now I understand conceptually, like, hey, usually off like say a hack squat, right? Usually you'll push out the bottom maybe a few inches, and that's kind of like you would hit a true failure point. So if you had that band that is aiding you, you might get every rep might be a little bit more stimulating. I understand. Also, every rep could be more fatiguing as well. Think about having extra 200 pounds on your back actually loaded. At the top, you could have a a greater proportion of fatigue you're generating with every rep, even though you're able to continue a rep. So there very well could be some negatives around banding. And if you want to look at research, we actually don't have a lot that would even suggest it would have a positive or a negative effect. It might just be more neutral. If you are just still training to that same effort level, it might not, you'd have to weigh that out. But at least some of the studies that we have, when you actually have movements that are loaded LinkedIn, it seems to show more of a benefit. So, and then going back to like talking about beginners, like it's probably even more meaningless then, because they can just easily get some good stimulus. And I think they could easily mess that up using bands to, create their MacGyver rig on whatever machine that they're utilizing. So in general, I don't really program it off a baseline.
Yeah.
However, I do find it's helpful in regression patterns. So if I have someone that was injured, and you loading the LinkedIn part of the muscle, it's also a bit precarious. It's usually where people tear muscles. So if you're coming back from an injury, I think that has good merit around that to gain some control and load the more precarious part of the movement. Also in someone where maybe they are trying to get into new ranges, and they are, you have someone that just like, I feel like I'm unstable in the bottom, and we could do pauses in the bottom, but even the band will slow it down a little bit for them so they can help progress up. But the idea is to progress them, like whether they're injured or it's a new movement pattern where we're trying to get that bottom position stabilized, to not use the band. So that's kind of where I lay with programming around using bands in that sense.
I'm not quite as scientific as John in this aspect, but I have a very similar understanding and belief with it. I think it's taken out of context completely, because it's about finding views and likes on social media, seeing the way they can manipulate a machine to lift more weight than they can handle. My worry for them, as you said, John, it's like if you train your body lifting the highest load at the top, and as you get deep in the length of position, there's almost no load, you're really setting yourself up for injury, even from an athletic standpoint, because now your muscles are not at all used to stabilizing or moving weight in that lengthened position, right?
Yeah, we take that band off. It's a shocker. You're like, oh shit.
Yeah. So that would be my worry, right? It's like they're using bands for this and that, and then one day, they try to do a squat, and they start the top part of the motion, feels great, and they go down the hole, and their muscles and their body's just not used to performing with that load in that lengthened position. I personally will always try to do every machine that I use now, especially if I change gyms and has to do different hack squat without any band, because my left knee is destroyed, has that permanent chondromalacia in the left kneecap, and knock on wood, I don't really have any restrictions other than severe heavy load or coming near to failure, which I don't because of the compensation. But I love full range of motion, and I will go all the way down as I possibly can in the hack squat. It feels comfortable to me. But sometimes my left knee gives me like, it just feels different, which I'm not even going to entertain that. I'm not even going to be like, one more rep, a little more weight. I'm not even going to entertain it. So I add actually the small green band. What is it? There's the orange is the thin, then the red, then the green, the small green. I add the small green, which doesn't offer much, but it's just enough in that bottom position where I can do 5-6 more reps without my knee hurting, and both my quads are equally pumped. They feel equal tension, and I can continue that motion. When I do my squats, obviously I don't use any bands. When I do leg press, now that I do full range of motion where my knees are practically touching my shoulders, I will also add that green band there, because the left side, because it's compromised and that left adductor tends to be overactive to compensate for that weakness. Sometimes my left adductor is like, dude, you fuck with me, I'm gonna pull. So I will add that green band sometimes, but I think they're great. I do think people have that. We're gonna coin that term, John, the MacGyver mentality. They run with that MacGyver mentality of all the tricks and bands and chains and everything, and they overcomplicate things to make it look a certain way when they don't understand the basic principle of like loading that muscle length and position, because it looks fancy or whatever. But
we just made the perfect case. It's why are you doing it? And just like, well, Chris has a great reason to be doing it, because that allows him to continue doing that pattern. Like he needs that from an injury risk profile. Most people don't, and or some won't, right? So that's just to be used when appropriate, but you need the rationale and understand why you're doing it. We used to use it in powerlifting. That's like with West Side Barbell, they came out with all chains and bands and using all that because we used like bench press shirts and squat suits, and it was to try to mimic the resistance profile of a squat suit to where it would get harder at the top. Like that's what you wanted to train with. And then like bodybuilding kind of got brought over, but with bodybuilding, it's just completely different application. So yeah, I think it has its place for sure. Just you need to understand, like, ask yourself, just, hey, why am I doing this? If you don't have a good reason, maybe set the band aside until you have a reason.
Yeah. That's a good summary there. And I think that's a good point for us to wrap up, because especially with you guys, the wealth of knowledge that you guys have. If I introduce another topic, it may be another 40 minutes before we get a break. So really want to thank both of you guys for making time to come on. I know how busy both of you guys are and the workload that you both keep. So really appreciate the knowledge and the time. Is there anything, because I see, Chris, I know that you just started your own company with the water. So anything that you want to plug, Chris, go ahead. You can go first.
Yeah. So if you guys want to reach me, I just want to let everybody know that I'm no longer accepting clients for quite some time now. I'm completely full, I'm overloaded. I'm looking at other avenues for education. And of course, this product developed, which is a water enhancer. So you could say it's similar to Mio, but our flavor profile is better. 10 out of 10 blind taste test had lemonade and sweet tea better than Mio. And of course, has a mineral component. We have just enough minerals in here where you can consume it all day and not really worry about kind of getting too much sodium. I know some of the other competing products out there that are aimed for hydration have like 1,000 milligrams in one pop, which is not generally the point of our product here. We're trying to incentivize adequate hydration, since so many people have a difficult time drinking enough water in a day. Specifically, you're in the off season, you don't want to drink water. And of course, general population have the worst time even drinking 2 liters, so that's one thing to add, but it tastes great. You can go drinkmore.com and check it out. My Instagram is Chris Tuttle RD, and Tuttle Nutrition is my business page.
Awesome. John?
Yeah, I ran into Chris at the last Olympia, and he like gave me 2 of the Moors, and I used them all, and they were excellent. I actually, a lot of times I just drink water during training, or just like carb mix. I'll use aminos just because I want to flavor the water, but I use that instead. And sometimes the lemonade stuff is so acidic, like I get like reflux with like some of the aminos that are flavored like that. His was not like that at all. So it was actually great for training or using intra if you just want something flavored. And that was no bias or anything around that. Discount code John 10. No, just like that. Anyway, I don't have more client spots. I'm mainly doing like the education realm with J3 University. So we open up the first Tuesday of every month for 3 days for new student enrollment. If you just want the one-on-one and basically how to coach yourself or coach others for physique development, and coming up with some new modules as well. We have the entire female module now. It's probably the most comprehensive for how to coach a female. And then we've also remade applied hypertrophy optimization, which is basically what we talked about today. If you want to take someone in the gym and know the cues, how to set someone up and assess them into a movement, that's the course, and that should be coming out next month. But IG is where I'm most active. So at John Jewett 3. And thank you guys both for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys. So for John Jewett, Chris Tuttle, Tommy Stiles, I'm Joseph PIRCHER. This was a Thinking Man's podcast. And until next time, guys, we're out.